Ghana's energy sector is grappling with financial instability, declining oil production, rising electricity tariff, and mounting sector debts. The country's oil and gas industry has seen a worrying decline in investment, with major international oil companies exiting the upstream sector, while independent power producers, on the other hand, continue to threaten power cuts due to billions in unpaid arrears. In this edition of Hot Issues, we explore what this government's plans are to forestall a complete collapse of the energy sector. A recent PwC report has exposed major revenue discrepancies at ECG, unaccounted for funds in the cash waterfall mechanism, and governance failures that continue to plague the power sector. So 2 weeks into office, I sat with new energy and green transition minister to discuss this report, the cost of fuel and production of same. I am Kemini Amano, and my next guest is John Abdulai Jinapor. Honorable, you're welcome to Hot Issues.
Thank you.
Let's start with the most recent issues, the PwC report. It was something that the ministry itself commissioned. How do the findings come to you?
Well, I'm not surprised at what we've just gotten to know in respect of the PwC report. Right in opposition, we kept insisting that the system was inefficient, ECG was mismanaging the funds, under declaration of their revenues, and involvement in so much procurement, unplanned procurement, some of them unbudgeted for, and that is what is culminated in this problem. On assumption of office, I asked for the first month report, and what I got to know, to the shock of my life, is that ECG collects about 1.5 billion, and of that amount, about 500 million is not declared as far as the cash waterfall mechanism is concerned. So what ECG does is that of the 1.5 billion, they keep 500 first before they move in to take some more from the 1 billion, which is in contravention to the policy, to the cash waterfall mechanism. And so far what we are realizing is that they've gone into so many contractual obligations. So many banks deduct their monies at source. They've just gone for what they call a super vendor. That super vendor takes 5% at source. They've gone for a certain payment app from a company that takes another 3% at source. And so, ab initio, you have a lot of deductions at source, which eats away almost a chunk of the money. I've just sent a directive to
I see. We'll get into some of the things that you're doing in that directive as well. But let's look at some of the issues that I want you to go into, for the sake of our viewers, real quick. We know that between the cash waterfall mechanism and then the cash settlement platform, the report tells us that some 5.3 billion cedis was unaccounted for. But does it say where that money went to?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So if you take a case scenario like the 1.5 billion, what ECG ought to do is to deposit all the money into a holding account. So all the 1.5 billion ought to go into what you call a holding account.
Right.
Then there's a cash waterfall mechanism committee, which we are reconstituting. The ministry is represented, Ministry of Finance, PRC, and then they would determine the formula to apportion the money. So if ECG decides to declare only 1 billion, what it means is that the 500 million, they keep that money and spend it in-house. So this 5 billion that we are talking about are monies that are collected, but ECG failed to declare those monies and decided to appropriate the monies and spend them. So when they do that, then power producers will not be paid, generators will not be paid, the transmission grid companies will not be paid, even the levies, which are statutory and passed by Parliament, will not be paid. And that is where you are having some of these major problems. And it's all because they are engaging in what I call very frivolous procurements. They have about 3,000 containers stuck at the port, generating demurrage of about 1.5 billion. That is unacceptable. Some of the things they've procured will last them 10 years. Some would even expire in 5 years. And so we've commissioned a committee to investigate ECG's procurements and the cause of these containers stuck at the port. And the committee is doing a very good job. So far, the preliminary report I've gotten indicates that there's massive rot at ECG. They do not follow procurement guidelines. They do not follow procurement processes. They do not conduct a needs analysis, and they just engage in brazen procurement. And so we are waiting for that report. But beyond that, there will be another technical report. What the PwC has done is a financial audit. We want to do a human audit, human resource audit, and a deeper audit of all the energy sector SOEs, which then gives us the clear picture and view as to the inefficiencies, so that we can tailor that in terms of our policy objectives and policy directive to address this. But in the interim, I've issued a very strong memo to ECG, directing them to pay all collections into a dedicated account. And this month, I intend to monitor that.
And this dedicated account is separate from what already exists?
There's an account that they hold, and we are of the view that it should be a national bank account where all the monies will be deposited. And then the cash waterfall mechanism will then apportion that. ECG must learn to live within its means. They came and tried to justify why they would want to withhold that money, but I've overruled that as minister. And the policy is that all these monies ought to be accounted for in a dedicated account. And even all those doing the initial deductions, they must stop that.
How many initial deductions do we have?
In fact, from the back of the envelope, it sums up to about 250 million cedis. That's a whopping amount. We would not allow that. Let me make that clear. As minister, I will not allow that. And whatever it takes to break that chain, I'll break it. I've tasked the new MD to also set up a technical audit himself at his level to look at how we can do away with some of those contracts. Especially ECG being a covered entity, multi-year contracts ought to be approved by Parliament. And it's the same with MPA. They have some contracts that we intend to review and seek Attorney General's opinion. Those that we can do away with, we will. Those that we cannot do away with, we'll try and renegotiate and see if we can make some savings. But clearly, we will not continue with the status quo under my administration. And that I want to make very, very clear.
There was one company in particular that the report mentions, providing that single system for ECG, making over 400 million cedis in the year under review, January 2024 to December 2024. Just one company. What are you doing about that?
I intend that we do a review of that contract. Personally, I find that contract unfortunate. I've called for details on it. I've called for a presentation, and I asked them, why do you need this software? It hasn't led to revenue increase. It hasn't led to any revenue assurance. And yet this company is taking so much money. And if you recall, in the days of opposition, we were fighting this contract. We kept insisting that it should not be signed. In fact, the MD came and assured us that it's 1.9% of gross. It's turned out that it is 3% of gross. And so even from information flow, we have a problem with that. That app was paid for by ECG, and yet ECG does not own that app. At the transition, they tried to migrate the whole system to that company. We're able to block it. And so all is not lost. I'm not against anybody. I have no problem with any company. I have no problem with any Ghanaian company. We want to ensure that there's value for money. We want to ensure that we do the right thing. We want to ensure that we protect the ordinary Ghanaian and the taxpayers' money. And so rest assured, we will tackle that issue. And we'll tackle that issue frontally and head on. I've briefed His Excellency the President, and he's given me full approval and authorization to move full steam. And that's exactly what we intend to do.
Are these initial payments the only reasons that ECG is not able to meet its obligations to the cash waterfall mechanisms to our independent power producers?
Not just that. Because of the fall of the cedi and the exchange rate differentials, ECG's base in terms of monetary value has eroded significantly, because most of the IPPs and the power generators are paid in US dollars. And so anytime the currency fluctuates and devalues, it creates a huge problem. And so even if ECG were to collect 100% today, they still cannot meet their obligations because of forex and exchange rates differential. That is one. Two, the losses have increased. Their ATCC, what you call aggregate technical collection and commercial losses, now hovers around 40%. That is unacceptable. The IMF and the World Bank project that we should be increasing tariffs by about 58%. I mean, how you're going to increase tariffs by 58% is another major thing. And inefficiencies at ECG. The collection, the losses, and all those issues ought to be addressed.
Are you currently facing that pressure to increase electricity tariff?
When they did the analysis, it showed that there was a huge differential.
Okay.
One, we don't pay for what you would call capacity charges or redundancy. It's not part of the tariff. And so right from day one, the state has to shoulder that bill. But even what we consume is woefully inadequate when you look at the billing or the approved tariff as against the cost of electricity. So if you do a one-on-one on a parity basis, there's a major differential. But more importantly, it's not just about increasing the tariffs. If you increase the tariffs and you still go with a leaking basket, I mean, you're going to have a major problem.
Right.
So we must fix the inefficiencies, increase the revenue base, reduce the losses, and then that can help us make some progress. But from what we are seeing, if we don't do anything, by the end of the year, the system will collapse. Already, Capower has sent a letter that they intend to discontinue the supply of electricity because we owe them 370 million US dollars. WAPCO and NGAS have also sent us a memo. The minister followed up and came personally to threaten that in March they would cut the supply of gas. ENI is also threatening. Jubilee says that right from November in 2023, not 2024, so over 1 year, they haven't been paid anything. So the challenges are quite enormous, and we are facing serious headwinds that we ought to address and take some drastic decisions. It's a difficult one, but we'll do it.
I mean, is it likely that the ECG will be proposing, an upward adjustment of tariff anytime soon?
They've already proposed that.
They have already proposed
ESRP, which is the Energy Sector Recovery Program, based on the model, shows that there's a shortfall of about the requirement of about 58% thereabout in order to meet that gap. But as a government, we also have a social contract with the people of Ghana. It cannot just be about piling taxes. We also want to see how we can deal with some of these issues. Even our PPAs, we want to go to Parliament and codify that and make it into law. That when we are signing PPAs, it ought to be through competitive process. And it ought to go to Parliament so that the people's representative can evaluate and assess what we do and determine whether they really want that contract or not.
Let's spend some time on this company that is making 3% of our gross collections. Do we know who owns this company?
I know the name of the company. The company is Haftel, and I think that we should put it out there. There's no...
I see.
Once you get into public business, the company is Haftel. I'm sure they are a profit-making entity. The problem is that those of us on the government side and ECG should have done a proper due diligence, value for money, and ensure that their interest is covered. So I don't even blame the private company. I think that the blame must go to the administration at that time, our negotiators, ECG, and the rest. What did they do? And I thought that the contract should have come to Parliament. For such a major contract that has significant implications, I think they should have come to Parliament. And so we will look at it again. And I've even reached out to them. And the company indicates that there are certain clauses or certain conditions that if they are addressed, the rate can come down significantly. Yes.
I see. Now, I want you to explain to us the difference between this Haftel software and the 20 legacy systems and the meter monitoring system also that are currently at play as far as ECG's operations are concerned. What's the difference really?
Honestly, I find some of them overlapping. I find some duplicity of roles. And I think that those are the issues we ought to be dealing with. And so without sounding judgmental, I hold the view that we do not need all those multiple so-called quality assurances. And that we can have a one-stop gap system that addresses all these challenges. And the Ghana Commercial Bank did a presentation. And I found that very, very interesting. I found their presentation very interesting because one is a state bank, the money stays here, their solution appears cheaper, and I think that without rushing to make conclusion, such a system and such an approach is worth considering. These are early days yet. We'll have to engage everybody. The president has just set up an energy security committee chaired by the chief of staff, and that should tell you his vision of elevating the challenge at the highest level. And so we'll be meeting, I think, on Friday to give some initial directives, following which would make some progress as far as the whole energy system is concerned, including the petroleum sector.
So we have these duplicitous systems, over 20 legacy systems. I don't even know what those are. But one thing is clear from this report, that despite all this, the investments we have made in our metering system and all that, it's still not collecting as much as we want it to collect for us. And I'll give you an example. At the bottom of the report, or more like in the beginning of the report, it makes reference to Adora system. The Adora systems gives us a postpaid version and a prepaid version. Postpaid version, we didn't have a problem with collection. But prepaid, we seem to have a problem with collection. And we've invested all this money. We wasted our money, didn't we?
I agree with you. I agree with you because it's a cost-benefit analysis. So if you spend $2 to collect $1 in taxation system, then you better not collect it,
right,
unless you want to maintain a certain system. And so if it costs you so much to do a program, and at the end the benefit is less, then you better maintain the existing system. And so you had a system that was operational, you were making some collections, and say maybe it costs you 200, but you collect 1 billion. Now if you bring another system and you collect 1.1 billion, that might look like an improvement. But if it costs you 400, then you better keep your 200. Then those are the things that I think ECG ought to be doing. And so that's what we want to focus on. Bring about a high level of efficiency, cut waste, reduce losses, and trim them. And we intend to trim ECG. That one is non-negotiable.
What does trimming look like?
That's what I said. The wastage ought to be reduced.
Okay.
The unnecessary procurements ought to be reduced to the barest minimum. If you look at it's like there's a rush to engage in procurement. And so I've put a hold on all procurements now. And I've asked them that if they want to do essential procurement, they should write to the ministry until the board is reconstituted. And when the board is reconstituted, we shall provide them with policy guidelines on procurement, so that we ensure that they follow strict adherence. Because I asked myself, if this company were yours or it was yours, would you engage in this level of procurement? You go to their warehouse, a lot of the equipment are at the mercy of the weather. I just checked from the port, and the security report I'm getting is that a container that costs about $500,000 is imported. ECG is unable to clear that container. Some way, somehow, somebody is able to buy that container at auction for 100,000 cedis, bring it into the open market, and resell it to ECG as $300,000. It will stop. And I mean, it will stop. Whatever it takes to stop that, no matter how unpopular that might be, we have to take that decision and stop it. Either than that, the system will collapse. When it collapses, nobody would survive it. So we have to do something very drastic, very draconian to deal with it.
I'm trying to figure out what the current administration wants to do about collection, because it would appear that is where we have the chunk of our problem. We've invested so much in meters, but this report is showing us that the prepaid metering is not giving us the money we want. It might be too late for us to go back and get the reinstall postpaid meters, right? Might be much more money, won't it?
I don't think the problem is even prepaid meters. I think there's a huge human element there.
Okay.
Even if you install prepaid meters, and you have people who come to tamper with the prepayment meters, people who do not ensure that the reading is done properly, you're still going to have that problem. PDS, with its terrible nature, appear to have done a bit better, except there is the corruption and the underhand dealings that created the problem. If we had done PDS and followed through with the roadmap that we developed, open, transparent, competitive process, let the best entity win it, and you set KPIs and monitor them, would have succeeded with PDS. But because people, through their own selfish interests, try to hijack the system, that is what created the problem. And so private sector participation is not that bad It's the way
which is what
do
you're
it.
proposing.
And that is what we are proposing.
Where are we with involving private sector?
We've set up a 7-member committee to consult. They've consulted the labor unions, industry experts, civil society, academia, everybody who matters. What do we do? After that, we'll take a common position and go to cabinet and seek approval on the best way forward. When we do that, we'll appoint a transaction advisor, we'll appoint a technical committee, and then a financial advisor, and then we will launch a competitive bidding process. We'll place some emphasis on local content. We do not, unless it becomes something that all of you are pushing for, we do not as a government intend selling ECG. It's a strategic asset, but then we can still get private sector participation. And if we get it right, I'm sure that we can reduce the losses, we can improve the revenue collection, but also we want to address the inefficiencies with ECG itself in terms of its management of its own resources, i.e. how they spend the little that they get. When we do that, we'll make some very good progress. And I think that I want to encourage Ghanaians to support us. Let's give this a trial. Let's do it right. We are open for criticism. We are open for suggestions. We want to do the best that we can for this country. And I have no personal interest. Let me be very clear that in all this, myself, the president, this government, we have no personal parochial interest. Our objective is to put our best foot forward and do the best for this country. And if we get the support and the advice and the encouragement, I'm sure that we'll make some progress.
Let's tackle a few things on ECG, then we can move away from that. Earlier, you had mentioned, the account for having a national account, a single account for ECG, appearing to deal with the report's position that ECG had 99 bank accounts across 19 banks in this country. So we are closing all those accounts, those 99
when
bank
you talk
accounts.
of a single treasury account, it's not necessarily closing every account. All you are saying is that anywhere money lands in, it should be swept to one account.
Okay.
Anywhere, once the money, maybe within 48 hours, transfer the money, so that by 28th or 30th, we know exactly how much was collected. And then based on that, you do the apportionment based on a pro rata basis.
But 99 bank accounts, that's a bit too many.
Yes, but because of ECG's operational area,
Okay.
we would have to close some, but not all. Because you need some accounts closer to consumers. If it's prepayment, they could pay on an app. But postpaid, maybe the person wants to walk to the nearest GCB account and pay. So it depends on the system we put in place. But 99 accounts is unacceptable. But I'm saying that you cannot close all the accounts. If you close all the accounts, unless you are asking people to pay everything through an app. In some villages and in some areas, they simply do not have those facilities. And so you want to create the opportunity for them to be able to walk to the nearest place and make payment. And so we'll balance it, but we'll deal with it such that it doesn't lead to inefficiency, but improves the system, makes it convenient for people to pay, and ensure that we account for every penny that is paid.
Why are we buying power in dollars when ECG earns cedis?
You have a good question, but the question is that who will come and sell his power to you in cedis? If we can get IPPs that are willing to sell in cedis, we'll do that. And that's why we're going to Parliament, so that you do a competitive process, and the best will show, because everybody will put in a bid. You can do an RFQ, an RFP, and then eventually do the full process and ensure that you get the best. But don't forget that a lot of these IPPs are what you call developers. So they go to a bank and say, lend me $200 million. I want to put maybe 150 megawatt plant in Ghana. The bank, before they give them money, would want to be assured that payment will come. Do you have an off-taker? And what they call capacity charge is nothing but what they call a capital recovery. Because if the man borrows 200 and puts it in Ghana and you don't pay him, how is he going to pay the bank? If Ghana also decides to build a plant itself, it will still service the debt. So it's not so bad, in my opinion, but how we get the price of the power, the terms and conditions, and how we ensure that we do not do full guarantee in terms of the capacity. And now people are talking about 40% guarantee so that at least you can offtake the 40%, but ensure that it doesn't become a burden on the state.
I see. So there's no way that we can negotiate any of our IPPs to start accepting CD in our own country?
We've negotiated some. We're going to Parliament, not necessarily cities, but I'm told some of them have taken a haircut. The previous administration engaged in that, but I've asked for a review. When we review it and we need to tweak it, we tweak it. If we find it convenient and acceptable, we'll proceed to Parliament.
How much do we owe them now?
The total debt for when we checked, for instance, this year we'll need about $2 billion. The shortfall.
Would it be?
2 billion United States dollars this year alone to make that payment. And at the last check, I think that the outstanding debt was about $9 billion or so. So we're talking of huge liabilities, serious liabilities that is crippling us. And we cannot continue like that's it. There's no other way out. It's not as if like you can just wiggle yourself and manage it without taking some tough decisions. And that's why we are determined to take these tough decisions. Fortunately, now the issue of excess capacity is even lost. Today, as we speak, we are producing just enough for consumption. Today, we don't have any capacity today. We don't have any capacity. Because of the shutdown, we've procured all the fuel we need to sustain power. 20,000 metric tons of HFO, about 70,000 metric tons of DFO, and about 450,000 barrels of light crude oil. And I can tell you, we are just above. And even with that, we are cutting exports. So excess capacity is not really the major one. And there's an export market. So if we get it right, and we're able to get good fuel, gas, which is cheaper and reliable, we can even export power and make money. But in the immediate term, especially within this year, it's very tough, it's very tight, and we need to just crack our heads and think outside the box in order to ensure that we provide reliable power, but also that we do not burden the consumer with so much high electricity tariffs. It's not easy.
And already ECG is looking that direction.
Yes.
By how much? What's the proposal?
From what we see, they are thinking of a 58% increase.
Oh, they're going with the IMF proposal that, we might
It's not
need
just the
58%.
IMF. They did the work with the IMF, with the
I see,
Tenga team.
I see.
So they will show you all the variables, what points to that figure.
Which means that you're in a very tough position, whether or not to support it or do it softer for the Ghanaian people.
We have to find a balancing approach to ensure that at least we recover some cost, but we are able to provide power that is affordable to the people of Ghana. And for me, that is paramount. We cannot burden the people. And with tariff setting methodology, when you shoot above a certain threshold, you won't even get the money. It's like taxation. You increase the threshold beyond a certain level, people won't even consume the power. Some people will find a way of not paying. And so we have to be very careful just piling tariff increments. That is not the solution. We have to balance it, bring about efficiency. So Minister of Finance has, for instance, indicated that he is willing to help us to put up a second gas processing plant.
Right.
That immediately reduces the cost of power. It makes gas readily available. It's more efficient. It reduces the cost of maintenance of the plants, and you have overall benefit. And I'm very grateful to the Minister of Finance for that assurance. We'll set up a team and we'll move ahead.
You have put in a number of measures already as far as ECG is concerned. To what extent could this help us defray the huge debts that we owe, and in fact, the huge bills that come from the IPPs?
Well, you have what you call the legacy debt, but you also have what you call mounting debt. So every month, ECG is unable to pay. So what it means, the debt is even compounding. And like I said, this year, ECG will require about 68 billion. They are able to cover for less than 20% of that. So on the back of the envelope, you have another debt of 58 billion staring at us this year alone, about 58 billion. And the Ministry of Finance, I'm wondering how they're going to be able to handle that. So what we are doing is to reduce the bleeding as much as possible and ultimately stop the bleeding. Then you are then left with a legacy debt. And you say, look, there's a legacy debt. Can we negotiate it? Can you take a haircut? Can you freeze the interest? Can you give us some flexible payment terms so that we can amortize that and deal with it? So the immediate thing we are working on is to stop the bleeding. Because when you are...
And I think you mentioned that the IPPs are already considering that haircut.
Yes, they are threatening. I mean, they are considering some haircuts.
Okay.
Some of them have agreed to some negotiated terms. Because we've told them that, look, if you don't meet us halfway, we will default. And if we default, Ghana cannot afford another debt default. And so the energy sector is a huge drain on the economy. And
are you able to share what those terms you have now with some of the IPPs?
Well, some have agreed to a freeze on some interest.
Okay.
Some have agreed to take some haircuts until about 15% thereabout. Some have also agreed that even going forward, we can't pay everything. So that's what brought about the category A in the cash water fall mechanism. But more importantly, too, we need to get fuel. If we don't get a fuel, the IPPs cannot function. And so we are dealing with a hydra-headed problem. And GridCo ought to be retooled so that they can evacuate the power. And all these are challenges that I have to deal with the team. And as challenging as it is, we are determined to put our best foot forward. We are determined to put in place all the necessary policies. Some will be very, very unpopular, especially with the energy sector SOEs. But that is the best way to go. And sometimes you have to take the bitter pill in order to gain some health and move forward.
Let's look at fuel when we come back. Don't go away. Welcome back. This is still Hot Issues. My guest is the Minister of Energy and Green Transition, John Jinapor. Thank you so much for your patience. Let's stick with fuel just a little bit. Then we move on to downstream activities. The report indicates that ECG spent over 400 million cedis on emergency fuel purchases. Do you understand what that's for? Could you explain why they spent such an amount?
So, for instance, today we have the shutdown of the pipeline.
Okay.
And because the previous government did not procure the requisite fuel and the required amounts, we've had to scramble to buy fuel. And so what the previous administration would have done would be to direct ECG to procure and pay. We've reversed that trend. We've asked that the lead generator or the lead generation company, which is VRA, should rather engage in that. And so ECG will no longer be involved in direct procurement of fuel.
And the reason you do that is because ECG is not a power producer?
It's not a power producer. Okay. They don't have that core competence.
Right.
That's not their work. It's a distributor. But at least VRA has been involved in the procurement of fuel, and so they can do that. Ultimately, we should get to a level where the IPPs themselves will procure their own fuel. All they need to do is to generate the power, we buy the power and pay. But as it stands, you have to do a hybrid and deal with gas and fuels. This year, we estimate that we'll need about 800 million to buy fuel alone in terms of liquid fuel, and another somewhere about 1 billion or so to pay for gas. And so it's a huge demand and a huge quantum. Because in March, we're going to see another maintenance. The previous administration deferred almost all the maintenance works to this year. And so maintenance works that should have been carried out previously, for some reason, they decided to push all to post-election. So you're going to have Jubilee operators, Talo, undertake a major maintenance work. We have Nigerian Gas and Gas with WAPCO doing a major one. And then in September, that's even going to be more critical. ENI and the operators on the OCTV field would also undertake a major maintenance. And that will mean that during all these periods, we are going to have curtailment of the supply of critical gas. And so we've been thinking about how to handle all these harms or all these shocks. And that puts a huge strain on the economy. But I made a presentation to the Minister of Finance that why would I spend over $800 million to buy liquid fuel when I can spend about $500 million to build a second gas processing plant.
Right.
And he found that very, very interesting. And he's promised that he'll provide us with the needed support so that we can quickly build a second gas processing plant. It reduces the cost implications significantly. And it means that we won't be going all the way to be buying liquid fuel oil. And so I hope that we get our acts together and do that quickly. When we do that, the savings will be very, very monumental and it will be very significant.
I see. But, you know, while we're on the subject of this fuel and issue of gas, the previous administration indicated that they had imported some fuel that was on its way at the time that you took office. Did you receive that fuel?
I don't know what they mean by that. We've just bought like crude oil. There's been no import.
Oh, is that the case? Because the former Swami MP, in an interview with us, had indicated that all those provisions were made because they knew that the shutdown was coming.
The records is there. If there's evidence, if they procured light crude oil, they should show that. If they procured diesel fuel oil, they should show that. What we got to know is that on our blind side, they had asked some company to supply some very minimal amount of HFO. But that will not take us anywhere.
Wait, how do you mean on your blind side?
It should have come at the transition. You are the transition committee.
Okay.
The essence of a transition is transparency. Is to get us to know what you are doing.
Right.
Is to get us to know exactly what we'll be inheriting. And so if it didn't come up at the transition, and we kept asking for information and that didn't come, that's a problem. But let me put on record that they had not put in any measure to buy light crude oil. They had not put in any measure to buy the critical distillate fuel oil that we require. And today we've had to procure about 70,000 metric tons of distillate fuel oil. We've had to procure 450,000 barrels of light crude oil. And we've had to procure 20,000 metric tons of heavy fuel oil in order to hold the system and provide the needed fuel to stabilize power supply. And like I said, we are supplying just enough to meet the system because some of the plants are not dual fuel plants. And so even when you have the fuel, you simply cannot power them. But fortunately, what we are producing and the curtailment of export should be able to hold the system barring any unforeseen circumstances.
But does the VRA have money to be able to purchase these fuel as and when they are needed?
No, they don't.
They don't.
In fact, they are in a critical situation. And so the Minister of Finance has had to support us with some funding, and which also means that it's a hit on the fiscal. And in economics, something must give way. As you take that money and you procure fuel to supply power, what it means is that there should be an opportunity cost. Somebody has to bear that cost, either in the road sector, in the education sector, or something. That is why we ought to get our acts right, so that we won't always have to go to the Ministry of Finance to take the little that we have to buy fuel.
In terms of getting a second gas processing plant, the Tema LNG terminal, which was supposed to have been completed by as of the end of December 2024, where are we with that, and what role could they be playing in this?
Well, I've spoken to Shell, I've spoken to Helios, and the feedback I get is at least for the next 2 years, it won't be available.
I see.
Because Shell prefers other markets to this market. And even that LNG is going to be quite expensive. It will be the most expensive gas of about $10 to $12 per MMBTU. And so it makes it the most expensive gas. But even with that, based on the briefing I have, it's not an immediate solution. It's not, and we can't depend on that. So we need to think of alternatives in order to deal with that. And that's why we are thinking of a second dedicated onshore pipeline, which provides us with the supply security guarantee and an alternative. If we had that pipeline, today with the shutdown of the WACP pipeline, would have just resorted to that and will supply that power. But energy security comes at a cost. And so you have to do a balancing act in order to arrive at a situation where you optimize whatever you have.
While we're on the subject of fuel, let's talk about petroleum. When will the prices ever go down?
It depends on so many forces. Now, the taxes and levies that people talk about, both taxes, levies, and even some margins, if you put them together, it comes to about just 18% of the price build-up. And so the days when you had about 45%, 50% of taxes as a component of the price build-up is now very, very low.
Is it? Because we still have about a dozen in our markup.
Yeah, but I'm saying that if you compare 45 to 18, 18 is lower than 45.
Well, you know, that's why in maths you would say that it is at a decreasing rate, but it doesn't mean that it's really low.
Well, if the bottom line is that if a liter of fuel that you bought, you pay taxes of 45.
Right.
Today, if you're paying 18, it means that if it had been 45, you'll pay much, much higher.
Right.
And so we can open up that conversation as a nation and discuss how we deal with this. But I intend that some of those levies, I'll take them to Parliament. Some of those margins, especially the UPPF, and some of them, I think that they should go to Parliament and let Parliament approve them. And through legislation, if you want to increase it or reduce it, you use the legislation to deal with that. In the spirit of transparency, we ought to bring more accountability, because I just said that the OSP is investigating the UPPF with an amount of 1.3
billion cedis.
Yes. That is very, very significant. That's quite a colossal amount. And so we've set up a committee involving the Chamber of Bulk Oil Distributors, MPA, BOST, government, the ministry, and all those who matter, to look at the whole sector and advise me as minister, following which we'll go to cabinet and go to Parliament with a Downstream Regulatory Act, which regulates the whole downstream, brings about clarity, job functions, and ensure that there's no overlap, but more importantly, bring about a high level of efficiency and ensure that the reporting mechanism is properly structured and defined. And we'll do that within the next few weeks. We'll go to cabinet and go to Parliament on that.
Let's look at some of the taxes and levies excluding the UPPF. Energy debt recovery levy, road fund levy, energy fund levy, price stabilization and recovery levy, sanitation and pollution levy, energy sector recovery levy, what's a special petroleum tax?
Special petroleum tax was introduced because at a point the economy was challenged, and so government needed some money to shore up the revenue base in order to invest in critical infrastructure. It expired, and then the previous administration renewed it. And so during our time, because we had some challenges, we thought that it has sunset clauses. But when the levy and its tenure expired, this government renewed it. And so we'll have that conversation. I mean, it's not for me alone to determine.
There's also primary distribution margin, bust margin, fuel market margin, marketers margin, and dealers margin. It will seem everybody in the value chain has a margin over here.
Yes, because somebody markets the product. He's built a filling station.
Right.
You have to go and take it.
So I was going somewhere with that.
Somebody transports the fuel. He's going to take a loan to buy fuel tankers. You have to deal with the person. Somebody imported the product with a ship.
No, but
insurance.
They're selling this product. I mean,
Yes.
besides these margins.
Yeah, but we are telling them that you cannot just put your margin on it.
Okay.
Other than that, we can't buy the fuel. Can you imagine if everybody is allowed that, look, determine how much you want to sell it. Fuel will go through the roof. So we are using law and regulation to say that based on market forces, we don't think that your filling station, you deserve more than, say, 50 pesos. And so that is a margin. You can come down, but you can't go beyond that.
Right. So two things, right? ASAP has, advised that these margins should be turned into taxes that the government can rather use to build infrastructure. Because, from their point of view, these margins go to these organizations and really they don't come back into the system to help build the proper infrastructure needed. In your Downstream Regulatory Act that you plan to take to Parliament, is this something you take into consideration?
ASAP is going to be a key integral part in terms of the consultative process. Ben Boachi himself has made a presentation to me, and I find it very fascinating. I find it very interesting. In this sector, you cannot claim to be an oasis of knowledge and know it all. And so sometimes you need to consult, you need to learn from people, and sometimes what people tell you helps you to shape policy better, and you ultimately take the credit. And so let me assure you, and let me assure ASEP that I find their contributions very, very useful. And in every stage and in every step that we take, we'll take their comments and their suggestions on board. Even at the upstream sector, they are making some very, very interesting suggestions because our oil production is declining at a very fast rate, and we need to do something in order to revitalize that sector. And so we'll consult broadly, but the decision rests with the government, and we'll make that decision.
I see. Perhaps when you get there, you decide whether or not these margins will be turned into taxes or they'll stay the way they are. But you mentioned that some of these levies and margins will be looked at in that downstream regulatory act. Which ones are likely to go from where you sit? Which ones are redundant enough that from a cursory look at it, you think they must go?
It's too early to say it here, especially when you've set up a committee to advise you. Then if you knew the levies that must go, you probably wouldn't even need that committee. So let me wait for the committee to bring their recommendations, to bring their suggestions. We'll subject it to some analysis, and together, because look, this country belongs to all of us. I'm just a minister. I'm one person appointed by the president to lead that sector. But I'm sure that together, if we can pool resources and pool our knowledge together, we'll make some progress.
I see. And so you, based on your explanation of the margins, I then want to find out from you what you think about the NPA's price floors.
I have asked for a justification. Why would you have a price floor? I thought that a price ceiling is to ensure that you don't hit the roof. But why would you put a price for that says that you can't go below this? One of the explanations was that some companies were engaged in predatory marketing. What they do is that they lower the price, and sometimes the big boys will do that in marketing. When a new entrant comes into the market, the big boy will lower the price, make you uncompetitive, you run at a loss for a period and collapse, and then they increase the price again. So I want us to all look at it critically and determine that, do we really need a price floor? Why can't competition edge out those who are inefficient and leave those who are efficient? But I've just had 2 weeks, if not less than that. I've just had 2 weeks. So in as much as we want to move with alacrity, we want to move with aggression, we also ought to do that with some level of caution and exercise some level of discretion. And so we'll get there and we'll take that decision.
I see. We can't wait to see what happens. The NDC's manifesto says that, listen, 400,000 barrels, that's what we hope to take it to. At the moment, we only have about 138,000.
Yeah, we did a peak of 195 thereabout in 2019.
Okay.
We've declined by about 32%. We're doing about 138, 135. And the projection shows that if nothing is done, it will decline further.
I see.
And so in the past 8 years of the previous administration, no significant addition was made. They didn't make any significant discoveries. We have this Springfield and ENI one lingering. The president is giving me some instructions. I've sought for Attorney General's opinion. A decision will be made within the next few days on the way forward. What we want to do is to send a signal to the international community, the oil majors, that we are ready to do business. The level of opacity, the level of underhand dealings that characterized the previous administration, we will do away with that. Let's open the system. We've also asked for some review of our fiscal terms. Some people believe that our fiscal terms are not that competitive and attractive enough. And all the big boys are graduating towards Cote d'Ivoire. Right. So Cote d'Ivoire is taking advantage and pulling us out of the market. And so how can we also attract more of the big boys, but also ensure that we maximize and benefit from oil exploration and production in Ghana? It's something we are working on. For a long time, the boss of ENI visited Ghana, and the message out there shows that this new administration is willing to do business. We are willing to provide a leveling and enabling environment for the oil sector players. And if we do that and we do it right and proper, I'm sure that we can turn the corner and begin to attract more investment in the sector.
How is I mean, your government and your office hoping to balance the need to attract investors and the need for the Ghanaian people that it's time we increased our interest and equity in these fields?
Well, if you are 5% of 100 billion, you are better off having 10% of 1 billion. So you ought to be a bit circumspect when you just said, oh, I want 10%. 10% of what? 5% of what? What are the benefits? Are you going to be carried? Or are you going to contribute from day one? Those are the things we are looking at. But clearly, what place Ghanaian interest very, very high and is paramount. And so whatever stage we take, even with ECG's concession, upstream, midstream, the gas processing plant and all that, to the best of our ability, we want Ghanaians to be at the forefront. Because then that leads to value addition, but also they retain the money here in Ghana and they will do in-country spending. And so President Mahama is very, very determined. He is very committed to local content and to Ghanaian participation. But we also want to balance that so that we can also get the needed FDIs into the economy in order to spur economic growth and ensure that we attain inclusive, accelerated growth.
So, I mean, we should, the Ghanaian people can expect that, we would have more equity if new fields are explored.
We would push for Ghanaians to have more equity, to have a better controlling interest, but to have an interest that maximizes their overall benefit, not just having the equity for the sake of it. I know some blocks that are owned by Ghanaians, and for some years now, no activity is taking place. It's a big loss to both that Ghanaian entrepreneur and to the state. But if you can attract some majors and some big oil producers to partner with you and then spare up the exploration process and ultimately begin to produce oil, because that is what you want to do, especially as we go through this energy transition. We must pump oil as much as we can whilst we brace up for the transition period. And our emphasis more is on the gas, especially our approach and our vision to achieve a total gas to power transition, so that all our thermal plants, we can run them on gas, even if they are dual fuel, but with some buffer, in order that if there's a problem with gas, we can easily switch to alternative fuel. And from the records, in 2022 thereabout, we made a savings of about 1 billion, taking gas consumption against heavy fuel and light crude oil and all the liquid fuels that we would have otherwise imported. So gas is the way to go. And we would prioritize that and push that forward.
And push that forward because, I mean, like you mentioned earlier, we only have one processing plant, which means that many, many years down the line, we're still flaring gas.
Yes,
that will be the case.
We have, especially as a state, we have only one processing plant at Atuabo. But offshore, the OCTP field is an integrated plant. It processes gas, and today supplies about 65% of our gas requirement. But we also import gas from Nigeria. But our objective is ultimately to be self-reliant when it comes to gas delivery and to export some of the gas and even export power. Burkina wants power, Mali wants power, Togo is just sent, even Cote d'Ivoire.
But we cut back our export.
We've cut back a lot of the export. I don't know, we share load. But Ghana first, and that's where we find ourselves.
So by how much? We cut back by how
Sometimes
much?
we cut by about 400.
I see.
But it's just for this period.
Just for this period.
I think the next 3 weeks would restore. So during this period, I asked that can we consult Cote d'Ivoire because of the West African Power Pool, if we can also get some power from them. And they wrote back that they need 200 megawatts from us.
Oh, I see.
So it tells you how challenging the situation is. And supply of reliable, uninterrupted electricity is quite expensive and it's quite difficult. But we'll do whatever it takes to ensure that we improve on what we've inherited.
I see. We'll come back a bit, shortly, and then discuss this issue of cutting back power. And I did say we'll wrap up on ECG, but there's something that came to mind, and I want to hear your thoughts on that. Don't worry. Welcome back. This is Hot Issues. My guest is the Energy and Green Transition Minister, John Abdulai Jinapor. Again, thank you so much for your patience. Let's talk about the Saltpond oil field. The civil society had raised concerns about the decommissioning cost, which you have come to meet. Is the picture that civil society is painting the same as what you have come to meet?
Yeah, if you talk to Dr. Donko and Co. and all those who were with us on the Mines and Energy Committee, we kept raising issues about the ballooning nature of the cost of the decommissioning. I mean, more than double what was originally anticipated. And the signal we are picking is that a lot of these overruns could have been avoided. And so we would investigate that.
Has any work been done at all?
Some work has been done.
Okay.
Some work has been done, but we investigate it.
Okay.
And ensure that we bring closure to that matter. And whoever is found culpable, the law will take its course. And why you do some of these things is to learn from the previous mistakes so that we don't repeat that mistake. And it will then guide us. And that's why we're even thinking of setting up a fund where the oil companies are supposed to pay some money there so that in future, when it comes to decommissioning, we'll have some lump sum that can help with decommissioning.
I mean, shouldn't that already exist?
It did not exist.
Those who have the fields would have that fund separate in that they would be doing the contribution already. So by now we should have that fund and,
no, it exists now.
And the companies. It exists now.
Now
it hasn't always existed.
It didn't exist prior to Saltpond. And like I said, because of the situation we've had with Saltpond,
okay,
government is had to take this decision in order to...
So the previous administration or during the John Mahama 1 administration, because I know Saltpond transcends that period.
Yes, this happened in the previous administration.
In the previous
And we supported it
okay,
as members of parliament to get that passed.
I see. Because civil society is of the opinion that that fund should already exist. So from the time when it was Lushuan, I hope I'm mentioning it right, Lushuan should have been making contributions as far back as 2003 to that decommissioning fund.
Yeah, but don't also forget that Saltpond was not that major. It wasn't a huge commercial one. I mean, it's Jubilee that really ushered us into what you call an oil-producing country. And that is what led about the promulgation of several laws to regulate the upstream petroleum sector, i.e. the Petroleum Exploration and Production Law, Act 919, and then we did Act 835, the Revenue Management Act, right, and the Local Content Act and all, Petroleum Commission and all those things. And so it's a learning curve. I mean, better late than never. But what we can do is how do we improve what we inherited and make it much more responsive and deal and address with the current exigencies that we'll find ourselves. And I think that we're making some progress in that regard.
I appreciate you talking to us.
I'm so grateful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is Hot Issues. I'm glad you stayed with us. I'm Kemini Amano, and my guest has been the Minister for Energy and Green Transition, John Abdulai Jinapor. I hope to see you again next week. Bye-bye.